There is a plateau in the heart of Asia that has been rewriting its own history for over 3,000 years, and it may still be writing it quietly inside the DNA of families who have no idea what they are carrying. For generations, the story of Persian ancestry seemed almost too grand to question. An empire that once stretched from the Aegean to the Industry. A dynasty that gave the world one of its first documented ideas of religious tolerance. A language, Persian, that survived the fall of that empire and outlived a dozen conquerors after it. Families across the Iranian plateau still carry surnames that seem to echo that grandeur, names tied to old provinces, to court titles, to Zoroastrian priesthoods, to Achaemenid and Sassanian memory. It is a story built for pride. It is also, researchers now suggest, a story that was never quite complete. Because when geneticists finally began comparing the DNA of modern Persian surnamed families against the deep genomic record of the plateau itself, the picture that emerged was not a single, unbroken royal thread. It was something stranger, older in places, newer in others, and in a few cases, pointing toward ancestral contact that no dynasty and no textbook had ever fully accounted for. The accepted history is not wrong, exactly. It is simply smaller than what the evidence now suggests. For most of the last century, the standard account of Persian identity rested on a fairly linear narrative. Iranian-speaking peoples, historians explained, migrated onto the plateau sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE. Part of the broader expansion of Indo-Iranian-speaking populations descending, ultimately, from steppe ancestors to the north. Over time, this population organized into the great dynasties, Achaemenid, Parthian, Sassanian, layering an increasingly sophisticated civilization onto the plateau, with Persian language and Zoroastrian religious tradition acting as the connective tissue holding a vast, diverse empire together. Surnames, in the modern sense, arrived far later, often formalized only in the 20th century, when the state began requiring fixed family names, and many families chose names that pointed backward, to a home province, a professional guild, a religious lineage, an old aristocratic association, or simply a poetic word meant to evoke Persian civilization at its height. It made sense. A grand civilizational story, matched by names that seemed to gesture toward it. But the first cracks did not come from politics or ideology. They came from something quieter. The maps themselves did not always line up. Researchers working across Iran and the wider plateau noticed that certain surnames associated with old aristocratic or priestly lineage clustered in regions history did not fully predict, appearing not only where the great Sassanian court once stood, but scattered into more remote provinces. Sometimes among communities whose local traditions preserved pre-Islamic Zoroastrian practice long after most of the plateau had converted. Other surnames, assumed to be distinctly Persian in origin, actually traced etymologically to older regional languages, Elamite place names, Parthian dialect terms, even a few borrowings that did not sit easily inside the standard Indo-Iranian framework at all. A name could sound thoroughly Persian on paper and still be shielding something considerably older underneath. That mismatch, a name from one era resting on a linguistic or geographic foundation from another, was the first sign that the surface story and the underlying population history were not identical twins. They were, at best, close relatives with a complicated shared past. This is where genetics stopped being a footnote and became the center of the investigation. Unlike surnames, which travel through law, marriage, religion, and political choice, DNA travels along more stubborn lines. Mitochondrial DNA, passed almost unchanged from mother to child, preserves a record of maternal ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, preserves a parallel paternal record, one that, in patriarchal societies with strong surname traditions, often, though not always, tracks closely with family name inheritance. And autosomal DNA, the vast recombining bulk of the genome inherited from every ancestor at once, offers something neither line can: a broad, population-level portrait of admixture, revealing not just who someone's direct ancestors were, but which populations mixed, when, and roughly how much. When researchers applied these tools to Iranian plateau populations, comparing modern samples against both regional neighbors and, Where possible, ancient DNA recovered from Bronze and Iron Age burial sites. The plateau did not resolve into a single genetic story. It resolved into layers. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. If this kind of investigation interests you, where a family name becomes a thread pulling toward a much older, much stranger history, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, so consider staying close for what comes next. At the base of nearly every sample, researchers found deep, ancient plateau ancestry, a genetic layer connected to some of the earliest known farming and herding populations of the Zagros and the Iranian highlands, populations whose genomes now appear, in modified form, not only across Iran but carried outward into South Asia and parts of Europe through millennia of migration. This was the plateau's oldest inheritance, present almost everywhere, though never in identical proportions. Layered on top of that came the expected Indo-Iranian steppe-associated signal, the genetic echo, researchers suggest, of the very migrations that most historians already associated with the arrival of Iranian-speaking peoples. This layer was real. It was significant, but it was not uniform, and it was not, on its own, sufficient to explain everything the genome was showing. Because a third layer kept appearing, smaller, more localized, and considerably more difficult to place. In certain communities, particularly in some of the plateau's more isolated highland and desert edge regions, researchers detected genetic signals suggesting contact with populations to the east and southeast, along old trade corridors linking the plateau to Central Asia and the edges of South Asia, signals that did not map cleanly onto any single well-known migration event, and that some researchers have cautiously associated with older, less documented population movements along the Silk Road corridor centuries before it earned that name. The story did not collapse. It widened. 3 explanatory frameworks now sit at the center of ongoing research, and no single one has closed the case. The first is straightforward continuity with layered admixture, the idea that the ancient plateau population absorbed successive waves of Indo-Iranian and later Islamic-era Arab, Turkic, and Central Asian contact, without ever being fully replaced, producing exactly the kind of stratified genome researchers now observe. The second is regional founder effects, the possibility that certain isolated communities, protected by mountains, deserts, or religious distinction, drifted genetically over centuries of relative separation, preserving older signals more intact than the wider, more interconnected population around them, which is one reason certain Zoroastrian-linked and remote highland communities appear genetically distinct even today. The third, more provocative framework involves what some researchers describe cautiously as under-recognized contact along the eastern corridors of the plateau, evidence, still being refined, that trade and migration connecting Iran to Central Asia and beyond left a genetic imprint considerably older and more persistent than the historical record alone would suggest, hinting at a level of ancient interconnectedness the standard dynastic narrative largely leaves out. The turning point in this research came not from a single discovery, but from the scale of comparison itself, broader genomic panels bringing together Iranian populations, ancient DNA from regional archaeological sites, and neighboring Caucasus, Central Asian, and South Asian datasets within one unified analytical framework. This is what allowed researchers to distinguish signal from noise, to see that the plateau's genetic diversity was not random scatter but structured history, written in allele frequencies the way sediment is written in rock layers. And within that structure came the twist. It was not simply that Persian surnamed families carried ancient plateau ancestry blended with expected Indo-Iranian input. That much fit the existing framework. The twist was that certain communities, including some carrying surnames tied to old Zoroastrian priestly lineages, names historically associated with the most purely Persian self-conception on the plateau, showed genetic profiles carrying a stronger, more concentrated dose of that older, pre-Indo-Iranian plateau signal than the broader population around them. Not diluted by history. In some interpretations, protected by it, insulated by religious endogamy and social separation into communities that functioned, unintentionally, as genetic time capsules. Not the group researchers initially expected. Not even the layer they expected. The genome was not simply confirming dynastic memory. It was revealing something older sitting quietly beneath it, A population story stretching back before Cyrus, before Darius, before the word Persian had any political meaning at all. This matters beyond any one surname or any one family tree. It is a reminder that human population history is rarely a straight line from a glorious point of origin to a present-day inheritor. It is closer to a river system, branches merging, splitting, disappearing underground for centuries, resurfacing somewhere unexpected. Empires leave records. Genomes leave residue. And the two do not always describe the same journey, because political history is written by whoever holds the pen, while genetic history is written, indifferently, by every ancestor who ever had a child. Picture, for a moment, the high plateau itself in late autumn, the wide, dry basins between mountain ranges catching the last gold light before winter, villages tucked against foothills where cansnots, ancient underground irrigation channels, still carry water the way they did centuries before any dynasty rose to record itself in stone. Somewhere in a Zoroastrian fire temple in a remote highland town, a flame that communities insist has burned, in one form or lineage or another, for well over a millennium. Somewhere else, a desert caravan route now mostly silent, its stone way stations crumbling, though the genetic traffic that once moved along it apparently did not fully disappear. It simply stopped being visible to history and started being visible, instead, only in blood. That is the quiet power of this kind of research. It does not need ruins to speak. It reads what the body already remembers. The old story of Persian ancestry was never false. Cyrus was real. The Achaemenid court was real. The language, the poetry, the religious tradition, all of it genuinely happened, and none of it is diminished by what genetics has added. But the old story was built at the scale of empire, and empires, however vast, are historically brief compared to the populations that lived on that plateau long before any throne existed and continued living there long after every throne had fallen. A surname pointing toward Persian dynastic memory is not a genetic verdict, and no responsible researcher would claim otherwise. It is a cultural thread, chosen, inherited, sometimes reinvented, that happens to sit on top of one of the oldest, most continuously layered human landscapes on the planet. What lies beneath that thread, according to the evidence so far, is not one dynasty story. It is the plateau's entire memory, folded and refolded across 10,000 years, still detectable, still legible, still quietly reshaping what ancient heritage is even allowed to mean. The map was never dishonest. It was only ever drawn at the scale of kings. If you want more investigations like this, where a name turns out to be the smallest visible part of a much older human story, stay with this channel because the plateau, it turns out, still has more layers left to read.